Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're tackling a pretty big one, intervention and state sovereignty.
Yeah.
You've given us a really fascinating set of sources that explore, well, a whole bunch of stuff, the history, ethics, legality of interventions,
Mhm.
particularly in humanitarian crises.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a topic that gets right to the heart of this tension in international relations, right?
Totally.
We've got this principle of state sovereignty, the idea that countries, nations have the right to, govern themselves without interference. But then you see situations where states can't or won't protect their own people from terrible human rights abuses.
And some of the sources you picked even challenge this idea of absolute sovereignty. It's like saying, hold on, this untouchable wall of sovereignty is kind of starting to crumble. What's causing these cracks, would you say?
Well, globalization and interconnectedness are huge factors. We're all so much more aware of what's happening around the world now, and there's this growing sense that we can't just stand by and watch terrible things happen. Even the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, is recognizing that this concept of domestic jurisdiction isn't set in stone. You know what I mean?
Right.
It can be influenced by international law and what's considered acceptable globally.
So the ICJ is acknowledging that what's happening inside a country's borders can have effects way beyond those borders.
Exactly. It's not always a purely domestic issue anymore.
You even pointed out a specific example of how the ICJ is adapting to these modern challenges, right?
Yeah, one that really stands out is their stance on humanitarian intervention, especially in cases of genocide. While they still uphold the importance of sovereignty, the court has made it clear that it can't be used as a shield for states to commit really horrific human rights violations.
Sovereignty comes with responsibility. If a state isn't protecting its people from mass atrocities, could we say it kind of forfeits some of that sovereignty? Is that where intervention comes in?
You got it. And the sources you gave me explain that intervention covers a whole range of actions, like using military force, imposing sanctions, diplomatic pressure, basically anything done by one state or more to address a serious situation in another state.
But the UN Charter, if I remember correctly, only allows intervention in really specific circumstances.
Okay.
Self-defense, right?
Right.
Or when the Security Council gives the okay to address threats to international peace and security.
Yeah, that's right. But then you get into this tricky area of humanitarian intervention, which is, as your sources point out, the most complicated type, ethically and legally. It's often done without the Security Council's approval, maybe by a coalition of countries or even just one country acting alone.
Hold on, so are you saying some interventions might actually be illegal? There's some pretty compelling examples in these sources, like one that jumps out is the different views on NATO's intervention in Kosovo back in 1999.
Right.
Some argue it was absolutely necessary to stop ethnic cleansing, while others see it as totally violating Serbia's sovereignty.
Yeah, exactly. That's the kind of debate this whole topic sparks. It raises a big question. Who gets to decide when intervention is justified? What are the criteria? And that leads us right into this ethical maze surrounding the whole idea of intervention. Some of your sources get into different frameworks for thinking about these questions, like just war doctrine.
Interesting. Just war doctrine basically sets out these conditions for when a war is morally justifiable. But if I remember correctly, it gets super complicated, especially when we try to balance national interests and global responsibilities.
Totally. Most people agree that protecting innocent lives is super important, but the how is always the tricky part. One really powerful example you found was the dilemma faced by Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, during the Rwandan genocide.
Oh, wow.
They're traditionally opposed to military intervention, but the sheer scale of the atrocities, led them to call for it. Imagine having to make that call.
Wow. That MSF example
Yeah.
puts things in perspective. Shows how tough it is for these humanitarian organizations when the usual approaches just aren't enough. So with all this ethical stuff in mind, how has intervention actually changed since the Cold War?
That's a great question. Honestly, it's been mixed. Successes, failures, and a lot of debates still going on. The UN is still the main body for okaying interventions, but we've seen more interventions by regional organizations and groups of countries working together. One example you pointed out is the interventions in Liberia and Sierra Leone by ECOMOG, the Economic Community of West African States Monitoring Group.
ECOMOG? That's a mouthful. But what's the main takeaway from that example?
What's interesting is that it highlights the growing role of regional actors in dealing with crises closer to home. But even with good intentions, interventions can be seen as neocolonial, especially when they're driven by outside powers. Understanding those regional dynamics is really important.
So it's not just about having the military power to intervene. You need legitimacy. sensitivity to the local context. Otherwise, it's just meddling.
Exactly. And this leads to something a lot of your sources brought up. We need a more holistic approach to intervention. It can't just be about sending troops when things get really bad. More focus on prevention, diplomacy, peace building after conflicts. What do you think about that?
From what I've read, it seems like relying only on military force is like putting a Band-Aid on a deep cut. You have to deal with the root causes of conflict, right?
Right.
Foster dialogue, support the capacity of locals to, well, to deal with these situations themselves.
You're absolutely right. And one thing that really stuck out to me was the emphasis on long-term engagement after conflicts. One source even compared it to the Allied occupation of Germany and Japan after World War II. Rebuilding societies, making peace. It takes time, commitment, resources. You can't just declare victory and leave.
That's a great point. We often focus on the dramatic parts of intervention,
Yeah.
but forget about the long, hard work of rebuilding and reconciliation.
So last time we were talking about how the whole idea of sovereignty is changing and how interventions are becoming more common. But let's get back to that burning question from your research. When does intervention actually become necessary?
Right. Because we can't just jump in every time a government does something we don't like. Or when there's, any level of suffering, there's got to be a line, a threshold that once it's crossed, compels us to act.
Hmm.
What did your sources say about finding that line?
Well, it's interesting because there are no easy answers here, right? The sources acknowledge that this is a really hotly debated area of international law and ethics. There's no magic formula that tells us when it's okay to intervene.
Right.
But they do give us a framework for thinking about it.
Okay.
One key point is that intervention should always be a last resort. We got to exhaust all the peaceful options like diplomacy or sanctions before we even think about using force.
Makes sense. But some of your sources also highlighted how those peaceful options, like diplomacy and sanctions, they often fail to actually stop atrocities. And sometimes time is really of the essence. Like, if a genocide is happening, we can't just wait years for sanctions to maybe work, right?
Absolutely. And that's what often leads to these agonizing debates in the international community, right? Your research even mentions Rwanda, where the UN peacekeeping force was just tragically inadequate to stop the genocide, largely because of, political indecision and a reluctance to use force. A really heartbreaking example of how delays can have these just devastating consequences.
So if peaceful means have failed, or it's too urgent to wait, what other criteria did your sources suggest for deciding when intervention is necessary?
They point to a few key things. One is the scale and severity of the human rights abuses, right? Are we talking about a few isolated incidents or widespread, systematic violations like genocide or crimes against humanity?
So the higher the stakes, the stronger the justification for intervening.
Exactly. Another factor is the likelihood of success. An intervention should only happen if there's a decent chance of actually achieving its goals. Otherwise, it could make things worse, right?
Right.
One of your sources even talked about the intervention in Somalia in the early 90s as an example of that. The original mission was humanitarian aid, but then it got, bogged down in fighting and ultimately failed to stabilize the country.
A classic case of good intentions gone wrong, right?
Yeah.
Without proper planning and, execution. Your research also talked about having a clear exit strategy. We can't just go in, fix things, and leave. We have to think long-term about how to hand responsibility back over to the local authorities.
You're hitting on that holistic approach again, which is so important, yeah. But what about the question of legitimacy? Even if an intervention checks all those boxes we've talked about, it can still be problematic if it's not seen as legitimate by the international community and by the people in the country being intervened in. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, from what I read, legitimacy is absolutely crucial. And one of the key ways to ensure it is by, seeking authorization from the UN Security Council. That Security Council resolution, it's like getting the stamp of approval from the international community.
Yeah.
Makes it clear that this isn't just some unilateral act of aggression.
Right, exactly. But as we all know, the Security Council can be totally paralyzed by disagreements, especially when those permanent members' interests are at stake, right? One of your sources even brought up Kosovo, again, where the Security Council was divided and NATO intervened without their, explicit authorization.
So it's a catch-22. If the Security Council can't act to stop atrocities, it risks becoming irrelevant. But if countries start intervening without its approval, it undermines the whole system of international law. What a mess.
It is a dilemma, and it's only going to get tougher, I think, as we face more and more complex crises in this century. Your sources actually offered some ways to address this, but none of them are easy. One is reforming the Security Council itself, making it more representative and effective. Another is creating these clearer international rules for humanitarian intervention. But even if we do all that, we're still going to be left with these really tough choices. Ethical considerations, political calculations. It's complicated.
It makes you wonder if there's a way to shift focus away from intervention as a reaction and towards something more proactive, right?
Yeah.
Because it seems like your research keeps pointing to this need to address those root causes that lead to conflict and human rights abuses in the first place.
You're absolutely right. That emphasis on prevention we talked about earlier is key. It may not be as glamorous as sending in the troops or launching airstrikes, but it's ultimately far more effective at saving lives. And it requires a whole different set of tools.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What are some of those key strategies and approaches for preventing conflict and human rights abuses that your sources highlighted?
Well, they suggest a whole range of approaches, but they start with early warning systems. Basically, this means having ways to spot potential crises before they explode into full-blown conflicts. It could involve, monitoring human rights situations, tracking political developments, or even analyzing economic trends that could, contribute to instability.
So it's about being proactive, gathering information, connecting the dots before things spiral out of control. Seems like good intelligence and analysis would be crucial for that.
You got it. Your sources also talk about the importance of good old-fashioned diplomacy and mediation.
Hmm.
This could mean engaging with governments, rebel groups, all sorts of actors to try to resolve disputes peacefully. It might also involve like facilitating dialogue between different communities or ethnic groups to try to address tensions and grievances.
So it's not just about talking to the people in charge, but also working with civil society, community leaders, those grassroots organizations, getting everyone involved.
Exactly. And that's where the idea of supporting these local peace-building initiatives comes in. It's about empowering those local actors to tackle their own problems, right? And find solutions that are sustainable in the long run.
It strikes me that a lot of these preventative measures require a deep understanding of the local context, the history, the culture, the political dynamics. It can't just be done from a distance, can it?
Absolutely not. And your sources really stress that partnership is key. It's about working with local actors, not dictating solutions to them. It's about building trust, listening to their concerns, and supporting their efforts to create a more peaceful and just society. What stands out to you about this approach?
Well, it's definitely more nuanced and long-term than those, more traditional intervention strategies. But it also seems far more likely to be effective in the long run, wouldn't you say?
I'd agree. And likely less costly in terms of human life and suffering.
It sounds like this prevention idea, it's a complex, multifaceted thing.
Hmm.
But it's clearly essential if we're going to really address humanitarian crises and, this evolving relationship between intervention and state sovereignty. Ready to move on to the next big topic?
Absolutely. We've covered the shifting sands of sovereignty, the criteria for intervention, and the importance of prevention. But now let's peel back another layer, shall we? The moral and ethical dimensions. And this is where it gets really interesting. Your sources offer all sorts of different viewpoints, pulling from ideas like just war theory, communitarian values, even cosmopolitan ideals.
Okay, color me intrigued. This does sound fascinating, but probably challenging to navigate. Where do we even begin?
Well, I think a good place to start is by acknowledging that any decision to intervene, even for humanitarian reasons, involves making tough moral judgments. There will always be trade-offs, risks, and, unintended consequences. We can't pretend it's simple.
Right. It's not black and white good guys versus bad guys. It's about weighing competing values, assessing potential harm, and ultimately trying to figure out what course of action will best protect innocent lives and, promote justice.
Exactly. And one of the core ethical dilemmas your sources highlighted is this tension between national interest and global responsibility. States are naturally concerned with their own security and well-being. But as members of this international community, they also have a responsibility to uphold these global norms and protect human rights, even outside their own borders. What do you think about that?
That's a tricky one. How do we reconcile those competing demands? When is it right for a state to put its own interests aside and act on behalf of this, broader humanitarian imperative?
You've hit the nail on the head. And honestly, your sources kind of suggest there's no easy answer. It's a judgment call made on a case-by-case basis, considering all those different factors. One example you found that illustrates this is the debate surrounding the intervention in Libya back in 2011.
Oh, yeah, that was a tough one. Some people argued it was necessary to stop a potential massacre by Gaddafi's forces. Others were worried it was driven by these ulterior motives,
Hmm.
like regime change or getting control of oil.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of how these real-world debates play out. It shows how important it is to carefully examine the motives of those who are pushing for intervention. Are they truly acting for humanitarian reasons? Or are there other agendas at play?
It's cynical, but it feels necessary to at least think about, because power politics can easily disguise itself as humanitarian concern.
Unfortunately, that's often the case. Another ethical challenge highlighted in your research is this whole issue of unintended consequences. Even the best intentioned interventions can have unforeseen negative outcomes. They can destabilize countries, worsen conflicts, and even lead to more human suffering in the long run. Does anything come to mind when you think about that?
The 2003 invasion of Iraq immediately springs to mind. The stated goal was to remove Saddam Hussein and prevent him from using WMDs. But it ended up leading to this long, devastating conflict that cost hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives.
That's a stark reminder that even when interventions achieve their immediate goals, they can have these far-reaching tragic consequences. We need to think carefully about not just the short-term wins, but also the long-term risks of military action.
It's like a ripple effect. You throw a stone in the water, and the waves just spread out in unpredictable ways.
That's a great way to put it. And one of the most important takeaways from your research is that interventions aren't just isolated events. They have a profound impact on real people's lives. And those impacts can last for years, even decades. It's not just a numbers game, right?
Absolutely not. It's about recognizing the human cost of intervention and, well, being aware of those long-term consequences.
Right. And that brings us to another key point your sources make, I think. It's the need for humility. We need to admit the limits of our knowledge and our ability to actually predict the outcomes of these complex interventions. We need to be willing to learn from our mistakes, change our strategies as we go, and we need to accept that even with the best intentions, things may not go as we hope. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a tough lesson to learn, especially with such high stakes. But it feels absolutely essential, given everything we've discussed. If we're going to tackle the challenges of humanitarian intervention in the 21st century, we need to be both principled and pragmatic.
Couldn't agree more. Guided by our values, but grounded in reality, right? Willing to act when necessary, but with a profound sense of responsibility and humility.
Those are powerful words. We've talked about ethical dilemmas, unintended consequences, the need for humility. But there's another aspect I think we need to explore: the legal framework governing these interventions. I know that's where you really geek out.
You know me too well. Yes, the legal aspects are fascinating, especially since international law is constantly evolving, right? Your sources dive into the UN Charter, which is like the bedrock of the international legal order. It basically lays out the rules for using force and establishes the Security Council as like the authority for authorizing intervention.
Okay, let's break that down a bit. What exactly does the UN Charter say about intervention? I'm ready to geek out with you.
Okay, well, the Charter is based on that foundational principle of state sovereignty we've been talking about. Basically, it says states have the right to govern themselves without interference. But there are exceptions, mainly in self-defense, and when the Security Council authorizes the use of force to maintain international peace and security.
So if a state is attacked, it can defend itself. And if a situation threatens international peace, the Security Council can greenlight an intervention. Makes sense. But what about situations where there's no armed attack, no direct threat to international peace, but you have these horrific human rights violations happening inside a state? That's where humanitarian intervention comes in, right?
Exactly. And this is where things get legally murky. The Charter doesn't specifically mention humanitarian intervention, so there's a big debate about whether it's even permitted under international law. Some legal scholars argue that it implicitly allowed based on the Charter's provisions on human rights, and this concept called the responsibility to protect.
The responsibility to protect. That rings a bell.
Yeah, we touched on it briefly earlier. It's this relatively new concept in international law, still developing, but the basic idea is that states have a responsibility to protect their own people from mass atrocities. And if they fail to do so, the international community has a responsibility to step in.
So it's a shift from that traditional view of absolute sovereignty to a more conditional one. Sovereignty comes with responsibilities, and those responsibilities extend beyond a state's own borders.
You got it. But if the Charter doesn't explicitly mention humanitarian intervention and this responsibility to protect is still a pretty new concept, then how do we actually decide when it's legal to intervene? for humanitarian reasons. Seems like a bit of a gray area.
I'm with you. It is a bit confusing.
Well, your sources point to the development of something called customary international law. Basically, this means that certain practices, if they're widely accepted and followed by states over time, can become binding rules of international law, even if they aren't written down in some treaty.
So it's that common law, but on a global scale.
Exactly. And some legal scholars argue that we're seeing a norm of humanitarian intervention emerge in customary international law. They point to cases where states have intervened without that Security Council approval to stop atrocities, and they argue that the international community has kind of implicitly accepted these interventions as legitimate.
So it's not just about what's written down. It's about how states actually behave, what they're willing to let slide. That makes a lot of sense.
Right. But of course, some states completely reject the whole idea of humanitarian intervention. They argue it violates sovereignty and sets a dangerous precedent. They worry that powerful states will use it as an excuse to meddle in the affairs of weaker states and, just further their own agendas.
That brings us back to those concerns about neocolonialism and the abuse of power, right?
Yeah.
Feels like we keep coming back to this tension between state sovereignty and the responsibility to protect human rights.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges in developing a legal framework for humanitarian intervention. How do you balance those two things? How do you prevent abuse while also ensuring that the international community can act decisively to prevent these atrocities?
Sounds like trying to walk a tightrope.
That's a perfect analogy. And there's no guarantee you won't fall off, right? But your research offers some ideas for navigating this tricky terrain. One idea is to develop clearer criteria for humanitarian intervention, maybe even like codifying them in a new treaty or international agreement. What are your thoughts on that?
It makes sense to me. It would mean like setting out clear guidelines for when intervention is justified, what the goals should be, where the lines are.
Exactly. Another idea is to give these regional organizations a bigger role in addressing crises within their own regions. This could help make sure interventions are more sensitive to local contexts and, less likely to be seen as neocolonial.
That sounds promising. It would empower those regional actors to kind of take charge of their own security and, prevent crises from blowing up into these global problems.
Right on. And a third idea your sources mention is the need for stronger accountability mechanisms. This could mean creating new international courts to prosecute those who commit atrocities, or developing new ways to, hold states accountable for failing to protect their own people.
So it's not just about intervening to stop bad things from happening, but also about making sure justice is served, that those responsible are held accountable for their actions.
You nailed it. And I think that's a crucial part of building a more just and humane international order, right? But building that order is an ongoing project. What we've covered today is just a small piece of that puzzle.
It's definitely a long and winding road, but your research has given us, like a roadmap for navigating the complexities of intervention and state sovereignty in the 21st century.
I agree. And while there are no easy answers or guarantees, I do think these sources give us a valuable framework for thinking about these issues and working towards a world where interventions, when they do happen, truly serve humanity. Ready for some final thoughts?
Absolutely. Bring it on.
Huh.
Okay, so last time we really dug into those legal frameworks around intervention. And honestly, it's clear this whole area is, well, it's complicated. It's like a giant puzzle where the pieces keep changing shape. So what are your final thoughts after, all this?
That puzzle analogy, it's spot on. It highlights why there's no one-size-fits-all answer to any of this. Each situation is unique, Every crisis brings different challenges. And there's always going to be some risk when deciding whether or not to intervene.
You keep saying it, but it seems like this need for flexibility, for being able to adapt, that's a huge theme in all the research you shared. We can't just rely on, old formulas. Things change.
Exactly. We have to think outside the box, tailor our responses to what's actually happening, and most importantly, learn from our past experiences, good and bad. What about you? What surprised you the most as you read through all this?
Honestly, the emphasis on building consensus. The sources, they kept arguing that interventions are just more likely to work, to be seen as legitimate, if they have support from a bunch of different players. States, regional organizations, international institutions. It's got like strength in numbers, right?
Absolutely. And it's not just states either. It's NGOs, civil society groups, even people in the local communities. Interventions should be partnerships, not something imposed from the outside. One source even said that getting buy-in from those local communities can be just as important as getting, the okay from the UN Security Council.
That's a great point. It really highlights the need to build those bridges, have those conversations, find that common ground, because ultimately, everyone wants a more peaceful world.
So true. Another key takeaway for me was that any intervention needs to have a clear goal, an achievable mandate, specific objectives, a timeline, and an exit strategy. Otherwise, it risks turning into one of those forever wars. Mission creep, unintended consequences, all that stuff we talked about.
So it's about being focused, knowing what you're trying to do, and when it's time to, pack up and go home.
Right. And to do all that effectively, well, you need resources. Your sources made that very clear. Interventions are expensive, both money-wise and in terms of people. If
Yeah.
you're serious about intervening, you got to be willing to put in the resources to see it through.
It's a good reminder that peace building, it's a long-term investment, not a quick fix.
Absolutely. One last point, and I think it's super important.
Mhm.
Transparency and accountability. Any intervention should be done in a way that allows for scrutiny, from the international community. And there have to be ways to hold people accountable for atrocities. You can't just let these things slide.
It's about upholding human rights, the rule of law, making sure justice is served, even when there's a conflict happening.
Couldn't have said it better.
No.
So as we move forward, in this world where intervention and state sovereignty are constantly evolving, these principles, consensus, a clear mandate, resources, transparency, accountability, they're going to be more important than ever.
Guiding stars, kind of, to navigate this complex landscape.
That's a great way to put it. And while there will always be challenges, uncertainties, I think the research does offer hope. We are capable of learning from our mistakes, adapting to new situations, and working together to make sure that interventions, when they absolutely have to happen, really do serve humanity.
That's a really thought-provoking way to end things.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot. The history, the legal stuff, the ethical dilemmas, and of course the practical challenges of intervention in state sovereignty. I think it's safe to say we probably have more questions now than when we started.
That's the beauty of a deep dive, right? More questions than answers. It means we're really engaging with these issues, not just settling for easy answers. It's about wrestling with the complexity.
That's where the real learning happens. So to our listener, we encourage you to keep thinking about all this. Go deeper into those sources, look for different viewpoints, and decide for yourself how you see this relationship between intervention and state sovereignty changing.
It's an ongoing conversation, a global one, and we need everyone's wisdom and participation.
On that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us on this, intellectual adventure. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep searching for those deeper understandings.